Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what could be called the theoretical psychology of struggle. And so the question you might be wondering is, how am I defining struggle? I'm thinking of struggle um, not necessarily in terms of physical struggle, so for instance, labor, hard labor that we might have. Um, but more the psychological kind of struggles that we go through in life. Um, and I want to start off by first describing how it seems to me that struggle is what could be called a psychological paradox. Um, and I'm using paradox in its traditional sense, two elements that juxtapose and yet complete each other in a certain way that doesn't make sense, that defies logic, and yet manages to work the way that it does. And so um, I would say that psychological struggle is indeed a paradox. And it's a paradox because it weakens the mind and it weakens our resolve and it weakens our abilities, it weakens our faith in ourselves. And yet, on the same token, it has the capacity to also strengthen all of those elements. So it has the element to, or it has the ability to strengthen our faith in ourselves. It has the ability to strengthen, um, you know, our abilities. It has the ability to strengthen our psychological mindsets. Um, and I'm starting off with this point because um, I think that, um, I've been thinking a lot about clinical depression and the way that clinical depression seems to manifest. And so, clinical depression is often described as chronic sadness, so to speak. So, depression, usually usually implies where you just lay in bed all day because you have no meaning, you have no purpose of getting up, and this is going to sound a little unorthodox, but in my opinion, I think that that exact feeling of depression um, can actually spur you on to do really remarkable things. Um, and depression isn't the only thing. Um, Depression, so real fast, so depression can definitely be something that helps you in the sense that you realize you're depressed, you realize this is a state of mind you don't want to be in, and then before you know it, you're on the flip side, and you're suddenly working really hard at something that you are passionate about, and before you know it, you're able to completely flip the depression on its head. And in my opinion, again, this goes back to the paradox of psychological pain and psychological suffering and psychological struggle. But the idea is that because you had that intense bout of depression, um, if you allow that depression to spur you on, it can ironically push you to do really intelligent and powerful things. It can essentially allow you to make a breakthrough. I would say the same thing is true with other elements of mental illness, such as psychosis. I think that psychosis has the ability to enhance creativity, um, and this would make sense when you think about the concept of cognitive disinhibition, which is basically the idea where because you can't filter out all of the extraneous material that you encounter on a day to day basis, you're able to mix those ideas in your mind, and that helps form a more heightened sense of creativity because it helps you with novel ideas. Aside from psychosis, there's also mania, and I think that mania is also a good example of this kind of thing. Mania can lead to an intense drive, it can lead to an intense will to get stuff done. And so these things that we generally, these psychological states that we generally see as crippling can actually become positive. So to get back to my point of struggle, this is the thing. When we're depressed, when we're manic, when we're psychotic, or when we're experiencing intensified emotions, whether anger or sadness, it doesn't have to necessarily be clinical definitions. Even when we're experiencing things like irrationality, all of these things are definitely a form of struggle. and they're a form of struggle in the sense that well, that they prevent us from doing the things that we want to do. And yet, on the same token, I think that it's exactly those things that we struggle with that somehow, if we allow them to, spur us on to do things that we normally wouldn't be able to do. And I think that that is indeed paradoxical. And the main point that I want to get on about that is that there's this kind of friction between between our state of mind and the negativity of that state of mind, and then the potential of that state of mind. So I've talked to people in the past, and they've kind of implied that nothing good can come out of mental illness, nothing good can come out of negative emotions, nothing good can come out of impulsivity. And yet, when I think about it more logically, I think, well, we're struggling with these things, so they've got to be there for a reason. And in my opinion, I think that if we can tap into these things, even if it's just very, minor things like minor obsessions that we have, so having to, you know, just a minor obsession, like, I don't know, I can't think of a concrete example, but I'm sure that you might have a minor obsession, something that you even take for granted, or minor examples of neuroticism, where we think about things that don't necessarily have any bearing on our lives. But in my opinion, I would say that, that causes us to struggle, but I would say on the same token that having that struggle is good because it helps us to tap into something more meaningful. I don't know how else to say that, but I hope that suffices. So I also want to talk a little bit about environmental struggles. So in our day-to-day life, there are many things that we struggle with. Some paths that we take are more likely to lead to success. So for instance, if we become some kind of engineer, if we become some kind of mathematician, more in the applied mathematics rather than the pure mathematics, I've heard that applied mathematics you tend to be more successful because it's applicable. Number crunching for businesses. And speaking of business, if you go into business, you have a higher chance of succeeding. It's the same thing with, medicine. As hard as all of these fields are, I'm by no means saying that they're hard. They tend to produce better paths and more consistent paths because these are consistent things that are needed. It's the same thing with sports. If you're a good enough athlete, then if you pursue that route, then you can succeed. But if you think about even these fields, there's an intense amount of struggle. What I want to get into specifically, though, is the harder, the fields that tend to not pay off as well. So that would be the arts, which would be any of the arts, such as writing or music, the visual arts. These things tend to pay off less because we live in a capitalist system, and it's basically what sells, or basically what captures the audience interest that's going to do well. What captures the eye of the curator at the art museum, for instance. And when I look at the history of the art of artists, I realize that the ones that have had the most profound influences usually are the ones that struggled. They struggled psychologically for sure, but they also struggled in terms of their environmental setting, because they weren't received, because they weren't well understood by society. In those, they were kind of seen as pariahs. They were kind of seen as people that were unfit, and that even today aren't really widely read. So one of the go-to writers for this, or the go-to artist for this, would definitely be James Joyce. I'm sure pretty much nobody out there that I'm talking to has read Finnegan's Wake. If you're lucky, you may have read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. You may have read excerpts of Ulysses even, but I doubt that you would have read Finnegan's Wake, which is probably his most important masterpiece. Though others would disagree and say it's Ulysses, but that's a whole other point. The point being that essentially it seems to me that we have all of these environmental struggles, but look at what it's produced. These environmental struggles produced Finnegan's Wake. This inability to be received by the public, to be received and understood, has led to breakthroughs. There's plenty of examples in history. I just found out today in Stephen Hawking's book that Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant is a very obscure work in philosophy, and yet it's considered one of the most important works of philosophy. And if you talk to pretty much any philosopher, they've at least read parts of Critique of Pure Reason. And it's considered about as important as the Republic. In fact, the Republic is considered as important as the Critique of Pure Reason, and those two books are considered two of the most important books ever written in philosophy. The point being, these environmental struggles of not being accepted actually lead to this kind of distillation of ability. And so it seems to me that we have kind of a misconstrued idea of what intelligence, genius, and ability is. And we think that ability is pretty much, in our modern capitalistic sensibility, as something that sells. But it seems to me that what is really able to make some kind of breakthrough is people that have been able to push through the current. And you know, you hear about that all the time. You know, you hear about the loner that is able to push through the current in some kind of movie, or you watch a movie and they break through and they're the hero or whatever. And so we romanticize it, but we don't actually think that it's practical in day-to-day living. And I would argue that it's actually that environmental pressure and that environmental pressure of pushing against the current that actually leads to breakthrough. And so basically what I'm getting into is I'm saying that essentially my main point is that it is these struggles, environmental and psychological, that I've mentioned, the psychological such as neuroticism, such as you know, depression, all of these things that lead to a kind of friction that help us push against and push past them to be able to make something better than we would have made if we'd been in a normal state of mind. And then environmental struggles that force us to push against the current and force us to try even harder, and push us in a certain direction that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to go. And so I only have about 3 minutes. I always have to limit how long I can speak. So I'll just wrap this up real fast and say there's two factors, it seems, that seem to shape people that can really change things for the better. And it's done through struggle. And it's done through two types of struggles, and usually in conjunction. Environmental struggles, so the resistance from peers. I'm reading A Beautiful Mind, which is a biography of John Nash, and he was not accepted by the people around him. And yet, look at what he accomplished in terms of game theory, in terms of mathematics, pure mathematics, in terms of economics. He won the Nobel Prize, and yet he wasn't accepted by the people around him. And in my opinion, and based off what I've read, it seems that that acceptance, or that lack of acceptance, was exactly what led to his success. Exactly what led to him going against the grain and breaking the mold. You could say the same thing about Gandhi. I'm also reading a biography about him, and it seems that it was his struggles that made an ordinary man extraordinary. So there's a scene where he's beaten up because in his early life, because they think that he's promoting you know, equality in race, equality towards people of different races, and he gets beaten up, and that shapes him to eventually do great things in the future. And I think that that is remarkable, and I think that's something we need to keep in mind. So again, to wrap this up, I would say that the two things, the two elements that seem to shape people to be able to break through the tyranny of the masses, so to speak, as John Stuart Mill would say, is the psychological factors that we take for granted and that we think are bad, but that actually spur us on to do greater things, and the environmental factors, you know, peer pressure, pressure from society to go down a specific route. And I think that the more that we resist those currents, the greater things that we can accomplish. And so again, this is Phoenix and my theoretical psychological explication of environmental and psychological factors of struggle and why struggle is important. And yeah, that's about all I got. I appreciate your time.